morning sun streamed through the towering glass windows of the Yamato Grand Hotel, casting warm golden rays across the marble floors of the main dining hall. Everything gleamed, from the crystal chandeliers above to the silver cutlery laid perfectly on the tables below. The hotel was preparing for an important breakfast meeting, one that could determine the future of an international partnership between East and West. Every staff member knew this was not just any guest. This was Mr. Richard Alton, a world-renowned billionaire investor with a reputation for perfection, impatience, and power. Richard Alton had built his empire through sheer will and ruthless intelligence. He had businesses in over 20 countries, and today's meeting in Tokyo was supposed to finalize his latest acquisition, a prestigious Japanese tech firm. The press was buzzing outside, cameras flashing, and even the city's most powerful executives were eager to shake his hand. Yet inside the dining hall, one small miscommunication was about to light the fuse of his temper. Among the staff preparing the breakfast table stood Hana, a quiet young woman in her late 20s who worked as one of the hotel's maids. She was humble, polite, and invisible, or at least that's how most of her superiors treated her. She moved with quiet grace, carrying a tray of teacups, making sure every detail was perfect. No one suspected she understood every word of the Japanese manager's rapid-fire instructions, or that she had once been an interpreter before life's circumstances pushed her into service work. Hana never complained. She believed dignity was not in status but in conduct. As Richard entered the hall, the atmosphere shifted instantly. Every employee straightened their posture. Conversation stopped. The billionaire's presence was commanding, his tailored charcoal suit immaculate, his expression cold and sharp. He glanced around, frowning slightly when he noticed a delay in the breakfast service. The Japanese hosts hurried to explain, but their English faltered, and the translator assigned to the meeting hadn't yet arrived. Richard's brow tightened. "I gave clear instructions," he said curtly. "I expected breakfast ready at 8. It's now 8:05. The senior Japanese manager bowed deeply, speaking apologetically in his native tongue, trying to explain a last-minute kitchen delay. But Richard didn't understand. He turned to his assistant, who whispered helplessly, "Sir, the translator is running late. Tokyo traffic." That was enough to ignite his temper. "Unacceptable," Richard snapped, slamming his hand lightly on the table. "This is a multi-million-dollar meeting, not a casual lunch. I don't have time to wait for someone who can't manage a schedule." His voice carried through the hall, sharp and commanding. The staff froze. No one dared to move. Hana stood near the corner, watching quietly. Her heart pounded in her chest as she saw her manager's face flush with panic. He tried to apologize again in broken English, but it only made things worse. Richard misunderstood the tone, thinking it was an excuse rather than an apology. His irritation deepened. He turned away, muttering under his breath, "This is what happens when nobody here speaks English properly. Communication is everything, and they can't even manage that." The Japanese staff exchanged nervous glances. They could sense his anger, but his words were lost to them. It was a moment of cultural tension, one that could ruin months of delicate business relationships. Then, without warning, Richard switched tactics. He began speaking in Japanese, fluent, crisp, and fast. The entire staff gasped softly, taken aback. No one had expected a foreign billionaire to speak their language so well. His tone, however, was clipped with frustration. "Watashi wa chodo ni kitimasu," he said sharply. "Kono jikan ni zenbu junbi sarete iru hazu desu." I arrived on time. Everything should have been ready by now. The room went dead silent. None of the Japanese staff dared to respond. They were caught off guard, not only by his fluency but by the intensity in his words. The manager bowed again, stammering an apology, but he fumbled his response, mixing formal and informal language, which only deepened the awkwardness. Richard exhaled, exasperated. "Doesn't anyone here understand proper Japanese business etiquette?" He barked, switching back to English. "You're a 5-star establishment, not a street cafe." The air in the room grew heavy with tension. Even the clinking of dishes from the kitchen stopped. Hana felt a lump form in her throat. She looked at the trembling manager, then at the billionaire whose frustration was bordering on disdain. She hadn't meant to draw attention to herself, but something inside her, a quiet strength that had long been buried, refused to stay silent any longer. She took a small step forward, her voice steady, but soft. "Excuse me, sir." The room turned toward her instantly. The manager's eyes widened in shock. The maid had spoken directly to the guest. "Hana," he hissed under his breath. "Step back." But Hana didn't. She met Richard's gaze calmly, her posture straight despite the plain uniform she wore. "If I may, Mr. Alton," she continued, her tone perfectly respectful, "I believe there has been a misunderstanding." Richard looked at her with mild irritation. "And you are?" "Hana, sir," she replied. "Housekeeping staff," he raised an eyebrow. "Housekeeping? And you're interrupting a business discussion?" For a split second, Hana hesitated, but then, with quiet resolve, she bowed slightly and spoke again, in flawless Japanese. "Sumimasen, Aruton-sama. Kono jikan no chigai wa, chokusetu wa shokudo no yoi ni wa kankei arimasen." "Excuse me, Mr. Alton. The timing issue isn't directly related to the dining preparation." The words flowed naturally, perfectly articulated, her tone polite yet confident. The billionaire froze. His eyes widened slightly as if unsure he'd heard correctly. Around them, the Japanese staff gaped. They had never heard Hana speak like this before. Her accent was impeccable, her vocabulary precise, her understanding of cultural formality flawless. Richard blinked. "You speak Japanese?" "Yes, sir," Hana replied, switching effortlessly between Japanese and English. "And if I may clarify, the delay was due to a miscommunication between the kitchen and service teams, not negligence. They were waiting for your assistant's confirmation before serving. As per Japanese custom, they wanted to ensure you were fully ready before the first course was presented." The billionaire's expression softened slightly. He glanced toward his assistant, who nodded sheepishly. She had indeed failed to signal that they were ready to begin. The realization struck him quickly. His anger had been misplaced. For the first time that morning, Richard said nothing. He simply looked at Hana, trying to reconcile the calm, confident woman before him with the role she played in the background. The dining hall was silent, the tension replaced by awe. Then Hana added in Japanese, her tone humble yet firm, "Watashi tachi wa itsu demo okyaku-sama o sonkei shimasu. Shikashi, kotoba ga chigau toki, kokoro de rikai suru koto mo hitsuyo desu." We always respect our guests. But when languages differ, understanding from the heart is also necessary. A slow silence followed her words. Even the billionaire, known for his sharp wit and impatient nature, found himself at a loss. There was something profoundly disarming about her composure. Finally, Richard exhaled, the anger draining from his face. A faint smile tugged at the corner of his lips. "You know," he said quietly, "you just prevented an international disaster, Hana." The staff collectively let out a breath they didn't realize they'd been holding. Hana bowed deeply, murmuring, "I only did what was right, sir." As the breakfast finally began, Richard found his attention drifting back to the maid more than once. There was something about her, the precision in her language, the intelligence in her eyes, the quiet dignity in her movements. She wasn't just a maid, she was something far more. And though no one else knew it yet, this quiet moment in the dining hall would mark the beginning of a story that would soon make headlines around the world. The breakfast continued under a strange new atmosphere, calm yet charged with unspoken curiosity. The billionaire, once fuming in frustration, was now uncharacteristically quiet. He spoke occasionally with his assistant, his tone subdued and contemplative. The Japanese executives, though visibly relieved, couldn't help stealing glances at the maid who had just turned a moment of tension into one of grace. Hana, however, remained composed. She cleared empty plates, refilled cups, and carried herself with the same quiet dignity as always, as though nothing remarkable had just occurred. But to Richard Alton, everything about her intrigued him now. He had met diplomats, CEOs, linguists, and world leaders, but few had managed to silence him, and never someone from the background staff. Her Japanese had been flawless, not just grammatically correct, but culturally attuned. She had understood nuances, tone, and honorifics with a precision that even professional interpreters struggled to achieve. He couldn't shake the thought, who exactly is this woman? When the breakfast concluded, Richard thanked his hosts with perfect decorum. The Japanese executives bowed deeply, relieved that the situation had been salvaged. As they left, one of them quietly remarked to the hotel manager, "That maid, she has the heart of a samurai." The manager smiled awkwardly, unsure how to respond, and glanced at Hana, who was quietly wiping the last glass on the table. As the guests dispersed, Richard turned toward Hana. "You," he said simply, his deep voice carrying across the room. Hana froze for a brief second, then turned, bowing politely. "Yes, sir?" He studied her with a curious expression. Not the stern authority from before, but genuine intrigue. "Walk with me," he said. The hotel manager immediately stepped forward, nervous. "Mr. Alton, please. She's only a service employee. Perhaps I can—" Richard raised a hand, silencing him. "No, I want her." And so Hana followed him out of the dining hall, through the marble corridor that led to the hotel's private garden. The air outside was crisp, the sound of running water from the koi pond blending with the morning hum of Tokyo. Richard stood near the balcony, watching the city skyline, then turned to face her. "You handled yourself well in there," he began. "Most people would have stayed silent." "Silence is often safest," Hana replied softly. "But sometimes silence can also be misunderstood." Her words struck him. There was something about her phrasing, wise, calm, deliberate. "Where did you learn to speak Japanese like that?" he asked. She hesitated. "It's a long story, sir." "I have time," he said simply. For a moment, Hana's eyes flickered with something, perhaps doubt, perhaps memory. "I studied languages in university," she said at last. "Japanese was one of them. I spent several years in Kyoto, before life took a different turn." Richard tilted his head. "You studied in Japan? As a maid?" She smiled faintly. "No, sir. As an interpreter." But circumstances changed. There was no bitterness in her tone, only quiet acceptance. Richard found that more striking than anything else. "So you left a professional career to do this?" "I didn't leave it," she said. "It left me." Her words lingered in the air. Richard didn't press. Instead, he leaned against the railing, gazing thoughtfully at her. "Do you know how rare it is to find someone like you?" he asked. "Calm under pressure, intelligent, diplomatic, and fluent in a language most foreigners never master." "I'm just doing my job, sir," Hana replied modestly. "No," he said, shaking his head. "You're doing far more than that. You diffused a potential disaster. My reputation could have taken a massive hit if that meeting had gone south." She bowed slightly. "Then I'm glad I could help." Richard studied her for another long moment. "What's your full name, Hana?" "Hana Sato," she said simply. "Sato." He repeated it as though trying to place it. "That name rings a bell. Were you ever involved in international negotiations?" Hana's composure flickered for the briefest second, a small, almost imperceptible pause. But she quickly regained it. "Perhaps you've met someone else, sir. Sato is a common name." He smiled faintly, but there was something knowing in his eyes. "Perhaps." The conversation paused. A light breeze rustled through the cherry blossom trees surrounding the garden. Then unexpectedly, Richard said, "You remind me of someone I used to work with, years ago during an international defense contract in Osaka. She was an interpreter too. Young, sharp, and completely fearless when it came to speaking truth." Hana didn't look up, but her hands tightened slightly on the edge of her apron. "What happened to her?" she asked quietly. Richard looked out over the pond, his expression unreadable. "She disappeared," he said. "Rumor was, she walked away from the corporate world after her company took the fall for a deal gone wrong. A scapegoat, they said. Brilliant woman. Never heard from her again." Hana remained silent. Her eyes were calm, but her heart raced. He remembers, she thought. After all these years. He still remembers. Richard turned back to her. "Tell me, Hana, if you were in her position, betrayed, humiliated, blamed for something you didn't do, and would you walk away?" Hana met his gaze for the first time, her voice steady but quiet. "Sometimes walking away isn't weakness, sir. Sometimes it's survival." That answer lingered in his mind long after she returned to her duties. That evening, Richard found himself sitting alone in the hotel's executive lounge, a glass of scotch in hand, staring out at the Tokyo skyline. His assistant, Olivia, approached cautiously. "You've been quiet all day, sir," she said. "Something on your mind?" He didn't answer immediately. Then, swirling the amber liquid in his glass, he said, "The maid, Hana." Olivia blinked in surprise. "The maid?" "She's not what she seems," he said. "You saw the way she handled that situation. Her language skills, her poise. She's trained, educated, That's not someone who just happens to be working in housekeeping. Olivia frowned. You think she's hiding something? He nodded slightly. Yes, and I want to know what. Olivia hesitated. Is that really necessary, sir? She helped you after all. Richard leaned back in his chair. It's not suspicion, he said quietly. It's curiosity. People like her don't end up in jobs like that by accident. There's a story there. And I intend to find out what it is. The next morning, while Hana was polishing silverware in the dining hall, the hotel manager approached nervously. Hana, he said, Mr. Alton has requested your presence in his suite. Immediately. She looked up, surprised. His suite? Yes, the manager said. He asked for you personally. He said it was business-related. Her heart skipped a beat. Business-related? What could a billionaire possibly want with a maid? Still, she nodded, wiped her hands on her apron, and made her way to the private elevator that led to the top floor. The elevator doors opened to reveal the penthouse suite, modern, elegant, filled with panoramic views of Tokyo. Richard stood near the window, dressed casually for once in a white shirt with rolled-up sleeves. He turned as she entered. Hana, he greeted. Thank you for coming, she bowed politely. Of course, sir. How may I assist you? He gestured toward the table. Sit. She hesitated. Servants didn't sit in the presence of guests, but his tone left no room for refusal. She sat quietly at the edge of the chair. I made some calls last night, he said casually, and I found something interesting. About 5 years ago, a woman named Hana Sato worked as an interpreter for the Ministry of Trade. She was instrumental in securing a $1 billion contract, until a scandal forced her to resign. There were whispers she was framed, but she disappeared before anyone could clear her name. Hana's breath caught, but she said nothing. Richard's gaze softened. It's you, isn't it? She didn't deny it. She simply looked at him, eyes steady, and said, Yes, sir. I was that interpreter. For a long moment, silence filled the room. Then Richard leaned forward, his tone gentler than she'd ever heard it. You don't belong here, Hana. You're far more than a maid. Tell me what really happened. Her eyes glistened faintly, but her voice didn't waver. If I tell you, sir, she said softly, you'll see why I had to disappear. And as the morning light poured through the window, Hana began to unravel the story that had changed her life, a story of betrayal, power, and the quiet resilience that had carried her from boardrooms to broom closets. For a few moments, the air in the penthouse was utterly still. The soft hum of the city below seemed distant, almost unreal compared to the weight of what hung between them. Hana sat with her hands folded neatly in her lap, eyes fixed on the skyline beyond the glass. She looked calm, but inside her heart was pounding like the rhythm of a long-forgotten storm. Richard Alton leaned forward slightly, his voice quieter than before. You said you disappeared, he began. Why? Hana exhaled slowly, as though gathering the courage to open a door that had long been locked. Because, sir, she said softly, the people I worked for decided that I was more useful as a scapegoat than as an employee. Her words were calm, but their weight was heavy. She looked down briefly before continuing. 5 years ago, I was assigned as the lead interpreter for a trade negotiation between the Japanese Ministry of Trade and several foreign investors. It was a high-profile contract, billions in value, countless jobs at stake. Everything went perfectly until the final night. One of the contracts was altered. A single clause changed, shifting ownership rights from the Japanese firm to a shell company registered offshore. It was a sophisticated forgery, one that could only have been done from inside the system. Richard frowned slightly, listening intently. And they blamed you? Yes, Hana said simply. I was the only bilingual officer who had direct access to both versions of the document. They claimed I must have made the mistake during translation. But I didn't, she paused, her eyes distant. The truth was, someone wanted that deal to fail. Someone powerful. And when the scandal broke, my name was on every headline. I was called incompetent, dishonest, even a traitor. I tried to defend myself, but by then it was too late. The ministry wanted a quick resolution. I resigned to protect my family's name. Richard studied her carefully. You could have fought back. I did, Hana said. At first. I went to the board. I gathered evidence. But when I discovered who was really behind it, I realized fighting would only destroy me further. He leaned forward. Who? She hesitated, her eyes flickering with something deep. Not fear, but recognition. A company named Alton Dynamics, she said quietly. Richard froze. His expression hardened, then softened again, as if he were trying to reconcile her words with reality. My company? Hana nodded faintly. Not you directly, sir, but one of your regional directors, a man named Eric Vale. He was involved in securing that deal. He had secret interests in the shell company that benefited from the forged clause. When the fraud was exposed, he used his connections to deflect the blame onto me. I tried to expose him, but he was protected, and I was expendable. Silence filled the room. The billionaire's face darkened, his mind racing through old names, old reports. Eric Vale. Yes, he remembered him, a charming, efficient executive who had handled Asia-Pacific operations. He'd left shortly after that scandal, claiming personal reasons. He told me the ministry had made translation errors, Richard said slowly. He even showed me documents to prove it. Hana's lips curved in a faint, sad smile. Those were my translations, sir, but altered. I tried to warn the authorities, but by then, the media had destroyed me. So I left, changed my name, moved to Tokyo, and took whatever work I could find. Her tone was steady, but her eyes betrayed the pain she'd buried for years. I thought if I disappeared, the story would fade too. I stopped being Hana Sato, the interpreter. I became Hana, the maid, and for a while that was enough. Richard ran a hand across his face, his voice low. You were framed for a deal that made one of my executives rich and cost you your entire career. Yes, Hana said simply. He stood, pacing slowly toward the window. For the first time, the unshakable billionaire looked unsettled. Do you know what that means, Hana? If what you're saying is true, Alton Dynamics profited from corruption. And I signed off on it. You didn't know, she said quietly. That's why I never blamed you. But others did. They said you let injustice happen. I didn't believe that then, and I don't believe it now. He turned to face her. Why didn't you come forward again? You could have cleared your name. Hana met his eyes. And reopen old wounds? It wouldn't have changed the past. I lost everything that defined me. My career, my reputation, my friends. But I gained something else, peace. I learned that dignity isn't something others can give you or take away. It's something you choose to keep even when no one sees it. Her words hit him harder than she realized. For years, Richard had defined his life by power, status, and success. But here was a woman who had lost it all and somehow stood taller than most people he'd ever met. He sank into his chair, silent for a moment. Then quietly he said, I'm sorry, Hana. She blinked, surprised. Sir, no, he interrupted, shaking his head. You deserve to hear that. What happened to you was wrong. And it happened under my name. I won't let that stand. Her eyes softened. Sir, please. I didn't tell you this for sympathy. He smiled faintly. Good. Because you're not getting sympathy. You're getting justice. She frowned slightly, unsure what he meant. Richard straightened, a spark of purpose in his eyes. Eric Vale thought he could bury the truth. He was wrong. I'll reopen the case, pull the internal records, and expose what really happened. If you're willing, I'll clear your name publicly. Hana looked startled. That's not necessary, sir. I've moved on. But he shook his head firmly. You shouldn't have to live in the shadows because of someone else's greed. You deserve more than peace, and you deserve restoration. For a moment, she said nothing. Then her voice softened. You really believe justice can still exist in a world built on power? He met her gaze steadily. Sometimes power's only purpose is to make justice possible. Their eyes held for a long moment, not as Billionaire and Maid, but as two people bound by truth, each carrying scars from a world that valued wealth over integrity. And as the sun dipped lower across the Tokyo skyline, both of them knew something irreversible had begun. The quiet maid who once disappeared from the world had just reawakened the conscience of a man who ruled it. The next morning, the penthouse was alive with quiet movement. For the first time in years, Richard Alton wasn't thinking about profits, stocks, or board meetings. His mind was locked on one thing, justice. He stood by the panoramic window, looking out at the Tokyo skyline glowing under the morning sun, his reflection staring back at him, layered with doubt and determination. Behind him, Hana moved silently, placing a cup of black coffee on the glass table. You haven't slept, she said softly. He turned slightly, giving a tired smile. Sleep can wait. I've already sent messages to my legal team and corporate intelligence officers in New York. They're pulling files on Eric Vale. Hana's eyes widened slightly. You're serious about this? Deadly serious, he said, his voice steady. You didn't deserve what happened. And neither does my company. She hesitated, her hands clasped in front of her apron. Sir, this won't be easy. If he covered his tracks that well, there will be people protecting him even now. People who have a lot to lose if the truth comes out. Richard took a sip of coffee and met her gaze. Then they'll lose it. There was a firmness in his voice, and not arrogance, but conviction. For once, his power felt purposeful. He wasn't fighting for control, but for redemption. That day, Richard Alton stepped out of his comfort zone as a billionaire tycoon and back into the battlefield of corporate warfare. Not for wealth, but for justice. By noon, his private office was turned into a war room. Screens displayed encrypted files, decades of contracts, and thousands of internal communications. His chief of staff, Lucas Grant, joined via video call, his tone cautious. Sir, you're reopening a case that was closed 5 years ago. If you go after Vale, he'll retaliate. He's a dangerous man, powerful, connected. Richard's jaw tightened. He framed an innocent woman to cover up his crime. If he's still breathing profit off that lie, I'll take every penny back. Lucas hesitated. Understood. But there's something else. We found irregularities. Vale didn't just profit from one deal. There are at least 7 transactions tied to the same shell companies. Billions, sir. Richard's eyes hardened. And we signed off on them. Yes, under your signature. Which means he made me his shield, Richard interrupted coldly. That ends now. He turned toward Hana, who had been standing quietly by the side, listening. I need your help, he said. You're the only person who truly understands how those documents were manipulated. I need you to analyze them again. Hana blinked, surprised. Me? Yes, Richard said. You have the linguistic expertise and you know the patterns Vale used. I'll have the encrypted archive sent to this office. She hesitated for a moment. Sir, going back into that world, it nearly destroyed me once. He took a step closer, his voice gentle but resolute. You're not alone this time. Something in his tone made her chest tighten, not pity but partnership. She gave a small nod. Then let's bring the truth to light. For the next 2 days, the two of them worked side by side. Hana's calm intelligence and Richard's sharp strategic mind complemented each other perfectly. She deciphered old contracts, pointed out linguistic forgeries, and traced translation anomalies to Vale's personal account system. Each discovery peeled away another layer of corruption. Late one night, Hana leaned closer to the glowing screen. There, she said quietly, pointing to a string of coded notes in Japanese. See this? It looks like harmless translation metadata, but it's actually a signature, a hidden approval tag Vale used to bypass internal checks. Every fraudulent contract bears it. Richard leaned in, reading the faint digital trail. This is the smoking gun, he murmured. He used language as his weapon. She nodded grimly. Ironically, yes. He took advantage of the fact that most of your team couldn't read Japanese deeply enough to notice. Richard's expression darkened. Then we'll use it against him. By dawn, the evidence was complete. A digital folder labeled Project Kintsugi sat on the desktop, Hana's name for their mission. She explained softly. Kintsugi is the Japanese art of repairing broken pottery with gold. It means embracing flaws to create something stronger. Richard looked at her, admiration flickering in his eyes. Then let's turn this break into gold. He called a press conference for the next evening. His advisors begged him not to. You'll destroy your own reputation, one executive shouted. Richard's voice was calm. If that's what it takes to save the truth, so be it. The room fell silent. The next evening, the world watched as Richard Alton stood before the cameras in a crisp navy suit, his expression grave but unyielding. 5 years ago, he began, a translation scandal cost an innocent woman her career and dignity. That woman's name is Hana Sato. Today I stand before you to say, she was framed. Gasps echoed through the press hall. Flashbulbs flickered. She was the victim of corporate corruption, orchestrated by a man who served under my leadership, Eric Vale. Evidence has surfaced proving that he manipulated documents to siphon billions into private accounts. He betrayed his oath, my trust, and the integrity of Alton Dynamics. Effective immediately, a full criminal investigation has been launched. Behind the cameras, Hana stood in the shadows, her heart pounding. She never wanted fame or attention, but hearing her name spoken not as an accusation, but as truth restored, it was overwhelming. Richard continued. Ms. Sato's professionalism and honor were never in question. Her courage in coming forward after years of silence has inspired me to ensure this company stands for justice, not greed. To her I owe not just an apology, but gratitude. He looked toward her, and for a brief moment their eyes met. The cameras followed his gaze. Reporters turned, snapping photos as Hana stepped reluctantly into the light. Her hands trembled slightly, but her chin lifted with quiet grace. In that moment, the world saw not a maid, not a fallen interpreter, but a woman who carried herself with the strength of truth. The room erupted in applause. After the conference, chaos followed. News networks across the globe replayed the clip endlessly. Japanese maid exonerated, headlines read. Billionaire exposes corporate betrayal. Alton Dynamics faces historic reform. Eric Vale was arrested within days. The evidence Hana uncovered was irrefutable. The stolen billions were recovered, and the scandal became a case study in global ethics. But amidst the noise, Hana withdrew from the spotlight. She didn't crave recognition, only peace. One evening, a week later, she sat on the balcony of the penthouse, watching the city lights shimmer. Richard joined her quietly, handing her a cup of tea. You've changed everything, he said softly. She smiled faintly. No, sir. The truth did. He looked out over the skyline. You could have demanded compensation, fame, anything. I already have what I wanted, she said. My name back. For a moment, neither spoke. The wind rustled softly through the curtains, carrying the scent of spring. Then Richard said almost to himself, You know, when I first met you, I thought you were just quiet, ordinary. She glanced at him with a teasing smile. And now? He chuckled. Now I think you might be the strongest person I've ever met. She turned her gaze back to the city, her eyes reflecting the golden lights below. Strength isn't about fighting, she murmured. It's about standing still when the world tries to push you down. Richard nodded, a quiet respect in his eyes. Then you, Hana Sato, are unbreakable. And for the first time in years, she let herself smile, not out of politeness or restraint, but from the deep, genuine peace that comes only after justice has been served. The weeks following the press conference were surreal for Hana. The world had seen her not as a quiet maid, not as a scapegoated interpreter, but as a symbol of resilience and integrity. Headlines praised her courage. Social media was flooded with admiration. Offers poured in from international corporations, NGOs, and even government agencies, all wanting to employ the woman who had exposed corporate corruption with unmatched intelligence and calm determination. But Hana wasn't motivated by money, power, or recognition. She had already reclaimed what mattered most: her name, her dignity, and the truth of who she was. She moved through the hotel quietly, still wearing her uniform at first, but staff and guests alike greeted her differently now, with respect, awe, and sometimes even subtle applause. Even the managers who had once underestimated her bowed a little deeper in acknowledgement. Richard Alton, meanwhile, had spent the days coordinating the fallout from Eric Vale's arrest. Alton Dynamics underwent a thorough internal overhaul. Policies were reformed, and the recovered billions were returned or redirected toward legitimate development projects. Richard and Hana worked closely to ensure that the justice served was not only punitive, but also constructive. One afternoon, Richard found Hana in the penthouse garden. She was quietly tending to the small potted bonsai trees, her hands precise and gentle. He watched her for a moment, noticing how she had always carried grace in everything she did. Hana, he said softly, approaching her, I've been thinking, now that the world knows the truth, you have a choice. You can return to your old career, accept any position you want anywhere in the world. She paused, her fingers brushing a tiny green leaf. I appreciate that, sir, she replied. But I don't want to return to the corporate world. That life, it taught me lessons, yes, but it nearly broke me. I want something different now, simpler, something I can control. Richard studied her quietly, understanding her completely. Then what will you do? He asked. Hana smiled faintly, a look of quiet determination in her eyes. I'll continue working here for a while, helping people quietly, teaching others what I've learned, and perhaps traveling, seeing the world as it is, not just from behind a desk or a press release. Richard nodded. Sounds like a good plan. But you know, the world won't leave you alone. They'll want to know everything. They'll want interviews, stories, features. Let them, Hana said, her voice calm but firm. I'll tell my story when I choose to, not because someone demands it. My life isn't a headline. It's mine. Over the next few months, Hana's life shifted in subtle, meaningful ways. She was occasionally asked to give lectures on international negotiations and ethical corporate practices. Students and young professionals admired her story of resilience. Yet she remained humble, preferring quiet contributions over public attention. The hotel became a small sanctuary, not just a workplace, but a space where she could continue her life without the weight of fame pressing down on her shoulders. Richard, too, found himself changed by the experience. The quiet strength of the woman he had once underestimated had left an indelible mark on him. He often found himself seeking her advice, not because she was a maid, not because she had been framed, but because she had a clarity and moral compass he admired. One evening, as the city lights glimmered like a sea of stars below the penthouse balcony, Richard approached Hana. You know, he said, leaning casually against the railing, I never imagined a day when I'd be grateful for a maid correcting me in Japanese. Hana looked at him, a small smile tugging at her lips. And yet here we are, he chuckled. Indeed. You've changed more than just your own life, Hana. You've changed mine. She nodded, thoughtful. Sometimes all it takes is one moment of courage. One moment of speaking up when the world expects silence. Richard's expression softened. And you've had countless such moments. You were brave back then. You were brave today. And I have no doubt you'll continue to be brave tomorrow. For the first time in years, Hana felt entirely at peace. The injustice that had once defined her existence had been rectified. She had been vindicated, but more importantly, she had reclaimed her identity. Her story had inspired countless people, showing that strength is not always loud, and courage often resides in the quietest of hearts. Weeks later, Richard and Hana walked through the hotel's gardens, now bathed in the soft glow of sunset. Guests and staff watched them pass, sensing a rare harmony between the billionaire and the once overlooked maid. But Hana walked with a serene confidence, no longer just a figure in the background, no longer merely someone who had been wronged, but a woman fully in control of her destiny. Richard turned to her, smiling gently. What will you do next? Hana paused, letting the golden sunlight wash over her face. I'll continue living honestly, she said. Helping when I can, staying true to who I am and never letting fear dictate my choices again. He nodded, impressed. A good plan, and one I'll support, always. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow over Tokyo, Hana felt a sense of renewal. The world had seen her rise from the shadows, but she had done so not for fame, not for revenge, but for truth, dignity, and justice. She had faced betrayal, silence, and invisibility, yet she had emerged stronger, unbroken and unshakable. The city lights flickered on, sparkling like stars at her feet. Hana Sato, once a quiet interpreter, once a wronged woman, now stood fully in her power. Her life was her own again, and this time, she would navigate it with wisdom, courage, and the quiet confidence of someone who had conquered the storm and survived. Not just to live, but to thrive. And somewhere in the distance, Richard watched her, knowing that the world had just witnessed not only justice restored, but the quiet brilliance of a woman whose courage had changed everything.